The German shells screamed overhead like banshees in the pre-dawn darkness of June 1st, 1918, as Marine Private Daniel Daly crouched in the shallow trench near Chateau Thierry. The earth shook beneath his boots with each thunderous impact, and the acrid smoke of cordite burned his nostrils. Just 40 miles to the southwest lay Paris, the city of light now trembling under the shadow of German artillery that grew closer each day. General Erich von Ludendorff's spring offensive had shattered the Western front like glass. Since March 21st, his stormtroopers had carved deep wounds into Allied lines, advancing further than any German force since 1914. The Kaiser's armies had pushed to within striking distance of the French capital, their field gray uniforms a tide of steel and determination that threatened to wash over the last defensive positions protecting Paris. The French Sixth Army, under General Denis Duchesne, was in full retreat, their blue coats dusty and torn from weeks of desperate fighting. British forces were scattered and bloodied, falling back toward the Channel ports. Into this maelstrom of defeat came the American Expeditionary Force, fresh-faced doughboys whose steel helmets gleamed like hope itself in the morning sun. Major General John J. Pershing had initially resisted French demands to scatter his troops as reinforcements among Allied units. The United States will put its troops on the firing line when it shall have formed an army worthy of the American people, he had declared. But with German guns thundering ever closer to Paris, even Black Jack Pershing recognized that desperate times called for desperate measures. The 2nd Division, United States Army, containing both regular infantry and the 4th Brigade of Marines, received orders to move forward and stem the German tide. These Marines were unlike any soldiers the war had yet seen. Volunteers mostly, men who had answered the call to adventure and glory with the same enthusiasm their grandfathers had shown marching off to fight in the Civil War. Colonel James Harbord, commanding the Marine Brigade, studied his maps by flickering candlelight in a commandeered farmhouse. The German advance had created a dangerous salient, a bulge in the Allied lines that pointed like a dagger toward Paris. Intelligence reports indicated that Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria's army group was preparing for one final push that would break French resistance entirely. The small village of Belleau and its surrounding wood had become the linchpin of German defensive preparations. Hidden among the ancient oaks and thick underbrush, machine gun nests and artillery positions commanded the approaches to Paris. If the Germans could hold this ground, they could launch their decisive assault on the French capital within days. As dawn broke over the French countryside on June 1st, 1918, the fate of Paris and perhaps the entire war hung in the balance. The Marines of the 4th Brigade checked their Springfield rifles one final time, adjusted their canvas leggings, and prepared to write their names in blood across the pages of history. None yet knew that the small patch of French woodland before them would become synonymous with American military valor, or that their sacrifice would earn them an immortal place among the greatest warriors their nation had ever produced. The battle for Belleau wood was about to begin. The morning mist clung to the wheat fields like ghostly fingers as Captain Lloyd Williams led his company of Marines across the open ground toward Hill 142. The date was June 6, 1918, and the German machine guns had been silent for nearly an hour, a silence that made every Marine's skin crawl with anticipation. French colonial troops streamed past them in retreat, their faces etched with exhaustion and defeat. One French officer, his uniform torn and bloodied, grabbed Williams by the sleeve. "La guerre est finie," he gasped. "The war is finished. You must retreat." Williams looked the Frenchman in the eye with the calm determination that had made him a legend among his men. "Retreat," he said in his Kentucky drawl. "Hell, we just got here." The words would echo through military history, but in that moment they represented something far more immediate. The collision of two entirely different philosophies of warfare. The French, bloodied by 4 years of mechanized slaughter, had learned the bitter lesson that frontal assault meant death. The Americans, hungry for glory and untested by the meat grinder of modern war, still believed that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. Gunnery Sergeant Dan Daly, a 2-time Medal of Honor recipient who had fought from the Philippines, to Haiti, moved among his men with the easy confidence of a professional warrior. At 44, he was ancient by Marine standards, but his presence steadied the younger Marines like a father figure. As German artillery began to range in on their positions, Daly's voice cut through the thunder of explosions. "Come on, you sons of bitches. Do you want to live forever?" The Marines rose from their shallow scrapes in the earth and advanced across the open ground with their bayonets fixed. The wheat was waist-high and golden in the June sunshine, but it provided no cover from the storm of lead that erupted from the German positions. Machine gun bullets cut swaths through the grain like invisible scythes, and Marines began falling with sickening regularity. Private Carl Brannan, barely 18 years old and from the hills of Arkansas, clutched his Springfield rifle as he stumbled forward through the deadly field. The boy next to him, Tommy Henderson from Ohio, suddenly spun around and fell face first into the wheat. Brannan wanted to stop, wanted to help, but the training hammered into him. At Paris Island kept his legs moving forward. According to historical accounts documented in the Marine Corps Gazette, the initial assault on the German positions at Belleau would resulted in casualties that shocked even veteran commanders. Companies that had numbered to 100 men at dawn were reduced to 50 or 60 by evening, but still the Marines came forward, their Springfield rifles cracking in response to the German Maxim guns that swept the field with methodical precision. Captain John Blanchfield's company reached the edge of the wood first, diving into shell holes and using fallen logs for cover as German bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. The forest was darker than expected, with thick underbrush that limited visibility to a few yards in any direction. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their branches intertwined to form a natural canopy that filtered the sunlight into dancing shadows. The Germans had turned Belleau Wood into a fortress. Every fallen tree concealed a machine gun nest. Every rocky outcrop hid a sniper's position. Wire entanglements stretched between the trees like metallic spider webs, and the ground itself was carpeted with the debris of previous battles, rusty helmets, broken rifles, and the bleached bones of soldiers from earlier campaigns. As night fell on June 6th, the Marines held tenuous positions along the southern edge of the wood. Behind them, the wheat fields were littered with American casualties, but ahead lay an even more daunting challenge. The real battle of Belleau Wood was just beginning, and every Marine knew that tomorrow would bring horrors that would test their courage to its absolute limits. The pre-dawn darkness of June 10, 1918, wrapped around Belleau Wood like a funeral shroud. Marine Captain John Thomason crouched behind a shattered oak tree, studying the German positions through his field glasses. 3 days of brutal fighting had taught the Americans a harsh lesson. About modern warfare, courage alone was not enough to dislodge a determined enemy from prepared positions. The wood had earned a new name among the Marines, Hell's Half-Acre. Every tree seemed to conceal a German machine gun. Every thicket hid snipers who could put a bullet through a man's head at 300 yards. The underbrush was so thick that companies lost contact with each other within minutes of advancing, leaving small groups of Marines to fight their own private wars against an invisible enemy. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Wise, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, had seen his unit reduced to less than half strength in just 4 days of fighting. The German defenders were not the demoralized conscripts that American intelligence had predicted, but veteran troops from elite Juger battalions who knew every rock and tree root in their sector. They had spent weeks preparing their positions, connecting their machine gun nests with communication trenches, and establishing overlapping fields of fire that turned the wood into a killing field. Corporal Lem Shepard, who would later become a commandant of the Marine Corps, led his squad through the twisted undergrowth in the early morning gloom. The 19-year-old from Virginia had already seen enough combat to last a lifetime, but the woods seemed to contain horrors beyond anything he had imagined. Bodies from previous assaults lay scattered among the trees, American uniforms mixing with German field gray in the democracy of death. The German 7th Army under General Max von Bohn had positioned some of their finest troops in Belleau Wood. The 4th Ersatz Division contained men who had fought on every major front of the war, from the beaches of Belgium to the forests of Russia. They knew that Paris lay just beyond the hills, to their south, and they were determined to hold their ground at any cost. Machine gun fire erupted without warning from a camouflaged position 50 yards ahead, the distinctive rattle of German Spandau guns mixing with the deeper bark of American Shawchats. Marines dove for cover behind fallen logs and into shell holes, but the thick canopy overhead made it impossible to call in effective artillery support. This would be a battle fought with rifles and bayonets. Courage and determination measured in yards gained at the cost of blood. Sergeant Major John Quick, another Medal of Honor recipient from the old corps, moved through the chaos like a man possessed. The veteran of Guantanamo Bay and the Philippines had seen warfare evolve from colonial skirmishes to industrial slaughter, but nothing had prepared him for the close-quarters nightmare of Belleau Wood. Enemy positions were so close that Marines could hear German voices through the trees, sometimes calling out taunts in broken English. As reported in contemporary accounts by war correspondent Floyd Gibbons of the Chicago Tribune, the fighting in Belleau Wood represented a new form of warfare that combined the technological brutality of the Western Front with the intimate violence of frontier combat. Men fought with entrenching tools and knives when their ammunition ran out, grappling hand-to-hand among the roots of trees that had stood since the time of Napoleon. By noon on June 10th, Captain Williams' company had advanced barely 200 yards into the wood, leaving a trail of casualties that marked their progress like bloody breadcrumbs. German counterattacks came without warning, gray uniformed figures emerging from the underbrush like phantoms, before melting away again into the green darkness. The Marines learned to fight in small groups, using hand signals and whispered communications to coordinate their movements. They developed an instinctive understanding of the wood's rhythms: when to move, when to freeze, when to shoot at shadows that might conceal an enemy soldier. It was warfare stripped down to its most primitive elements, where survival depended on split-second decisions and the ability to kill before being killed. As darkness fell once again over Belleau Wood, the Marines consolidated their hard-won positions and prepared for another night of German infiltration attempts. They had gained precious ground, but at a cost that made even the most optimistic commanders question whether any objective was worth such sacrifice. Tomorrow would bring new horrors, new tests of courage, and new reasons to discover just how much punishment the human spirit could endure. Dawn on June 13, 1918, revealed the true cost of the American advance into Belleau Wood. Major Maurice Shearer, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines, counted his remaining men by the pale light filtering through the shattered canopy above. Of the 800 Marines who had entered the wood with him 5 days earlier, fewer than 300 remained combat effective. The German resistance had stiffened with each passing day. General von Katte's 4th Ersatz Division had received reinforcements during the night, fresh machine gun crews and ammunition carriers, who moved through their prepared positions like ghosts. Every fallen log had become a fortress, every depression in the ground a potential tomb for unwary Marines. Captain Clifton Cates, commanding the 96th Company, 6th Marines, embodied the spirit that would carry the corps through its darkest hours. Wounded twice in the previous day's fighting, the young officer from Missouri refused evacuation and continued to lead his men from the front. His company had been reduced to fewer than 40 men, but they held a crucial position overlooking a German supply route that wound through the heart of the wood. The tactics that had worked on the plains of Kansas and the beaches of the Caribbean proved inadequate against the sophisticated defenses the Germans had constructed. Machine gun nests were positioned to provide mutual support, with carefully calculated fields of fire that created killing zones at every natural avenue of approach. Communication trenches allowed German troops to reinforce threatened positions or withdraw before American artillery could range in on their locations. First Lieutenant Graves Erskine, leading a reconnaissance patrol through the northern section of the wood, discovered the extent of German preparations. Enemy positions extended far deeper than American intelligence had estimated, with multiple defensive lines connected by underground tunnels and communication trenches. The Germans had transformed Belleau Wood into a fortress that would have impressed the engineers who built the Maginot Line. The psychological toll of the fighting was becoming as significant as the physical casualties. Marines who had entered the battle with the confidence of American invincibility found themselves facing an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. German artillery observers, hidden high in the oak trees, could call down devastating barrages on American positions with pinpoint accuracy. Corporal John Kelly, a former boxer from New York, found himself leading what remained of his squad through a nightmare landscape of splintered trees and scattered equipment. The 22-year-old had enlisted seeking adventure and found himself in a situation that tested every assumption he had ever held about warfare and heroism. When his squad leader fell to a German sniper, Kelly took command with the natural authority that marked him as a future leader of Marines. The German defensive strategy was working exactly as intended. By forcing the Americans to fight for every yard of ground, they were bleeding the Marine Corps white while giving their own forces time to prepare fallback positions closer to Paris. Every hour the Americans spent fighting for Belleau. What was another hour German engineers could use to strengthen the defenses. Around the French capital, medical corpsmen like pharmacist's mate John Balch moved through the chaos with a courage that matched any rifleman's. The Navy medics attached to Marine units had volunteered for duty that placed them in constant danger, treating wounded Marines under fire while German snipers specifically targeted anyone wearing the Red Cross armband. Balch himself would be wounded 3 times before the battle ended, but continued to serve until physically unable to stand. As documented in military records preserved by the National Archives, the fighting in Belleau Wood had evolved into something resembling the siege warfare of the American Civil War more than the mobile campaigns that had characterized the early years of World War I. Both sides dug in and fought for individual positions with a ferocity that shocked even veteran observers. By evening on June 13th, the Marines held approximately 1/3 of Belleau Wood, but at a cost that made their commanders question whether the objective justified the sacrifice. Reports reaching higher headquarters spoke of companies reduced to squad size, of lieutenants commanding battalions, of Marines so exhausted they fell asleep standing up in their foxholes. Yet something remarkable was happening among the survivors. The shared ordeal was forging bonds stronger than steel, creating a brotherhood that would endure long after the guns fell silent. The Marines of Belleau Wood were discovering that they possessed a strength they had never known they had, a capacity for endurance that would become legendary in the annals of military history. The crucible was far from finished with them. The pre-dawn blackness of June 18, 1918, seemed to pulse with malevolent energy as German artillery began its morning ritual of death. Captain Lloyd Williams pressed his face into the muddy earth of his shell hole, counting the seconds between the whistle of incoming rounds and their devastating impact. After 2 weeks in hell, he had learned to read the subtle differences in artillery fire the way a musician reads notes on a page. The German 4th Ersatz Division had earned a grudging respect for their American opponents. Intelligence reports intercepted by Allied cryptographers revealed that German commanders had begun referring to the Marines as Teufelhunden, devil dogs. The nickname would stick long after the war ended, but in the summer of 1918, it represented a hard-won acknowledgement of American fighting spirit from an enemy who granted respect only to the most formidable opponents. Brigadier General James Harbord, commanding the Marine Brigade, had watched his finest units bleed away in the green maze of Belleau Wood. The 4th Brigade had entered the battle with over 8,000 men. Casualties now exceeded 60%, with some companies reduced to fewer than 20 effectives. Yet every dawn brought new attacks, new attempts to drive the stubborn Germans from their forest fortress. The character of the fighting had evolved into something uniquely horrible. Traditional military tactics proved useless in the dense undergrowth, where visibility rarely exceeded 20 yards. Combat became intensely personal. Men killed each other at ranges where they could see the fear in their enemies' eyes. Bayonet charges ended in brutal hand-to-hand combat among the ancient oaks, with Marines and Germans grappling in life-or-death struggles that left survivors permanently scarred. Corporal John Kelly had emerged as one of the battle's unlikely heroes. The former New York boxer had single-handedly eliminated 3 German machine gun positions During the previous day's advance, crawling through undergrowth so thick that branches scraped the paint from his helmet, his exploits had earned him rapid promotion and the admiration of men who had initially dismissed him as another city tough guy playing soldier. The Germans defending Belleau would represented some of the Kaiser's finest troops. Many had fought at Verdun and the Somme, battles that had introduced them to the industrial-scale slaughter of modern warfare. They knew that every day they held the Americans in the wood was another day. Their comrades could prepare the final assault on Paris. Their determination matched that of their opponents, creating a stalemate that consumed lives with horrifying efficiency. Marine aviation was still in its infancy, but pilots like First Lieutenant Ralph Talbot flew their fragile biplanes over the wood, at treetop level, mapping German positions and calling in artillery strikes. The 21-year-old pilot from Massachusetts had already survived 3 crash landings, but continued to volunteer for the most dangerous reconnaissance missions. His detailed sketches of enemy positions provided the first accurate intelligence about the true extent of German fortifications, as documented in dispatches published by the Associated Press. In late June 1918, the fighting had attracted international attention as a test of American resolve. European observers, accustomed to years of static trench warfare, watched with fascination as American forces repeatedly hurled themselves against prepared positions. With a disregard for casualties that bordered on reckless, the psychological warfare was as brutal as the physical combat. German loudspeakers, hidden throughout the wood, played American popular songs at full volume during quiet periods, then followed them with propaganda broadcasts describing the hopelessness of the Marine position. American artillery responded by shelling the loudspeaker positions, but the Germans simply moved their equipment and resumed the psychological assault from new locations. Captain Clifton Cates had been wounded 4 times, but refused evacuation, leading his depleted company through attacks that had become exercises in controlled desperation. The young officer from Missouri had discovered leadership qualities he never knew he possessed, learning to inspire men who had every reason to surrender or retreat. His ability to remain calm under fire became legendary among Marines who looked to him for guidance in their darkest moments. The medical situation was becoming critical. Corpsmen like John Balch worked around the clock treating wounds that would have been fatal. In any previous conflict, the proximity of German positions made evacuation extremely dangerous, forcing wounded Marines to remain in forward positions for days before they could be moved to aid stations. Many died not from their wounds but from exposure and infection that proper medical care could have prevented. By June 20th, the Marines had gained control of approximately 2/3 of Belleau Wood, but the cost had been staggering. Entire platoons had been wiped out, and companies that had entered the battle with full strength now existed only on paper. Yet the survivors pressed forward with a determination that amazed their French allies and terrified their German enemies. The devil dogs had found their calling in the green hell of Belleau Wood. The morning of June 23, 1918, dawned gray and drizzling as Major Maurice Shearer studied the German positions through his periscope. 3 weeks of continuous fighting had reduced his battalion to fewer than 150 men, but intelligence reports indicated that the enemy was finally weakening. German deserters, captured during night patrols, spoke of ammunition shortages and declining morale among the defenders. The decision to launch one final, coordinated assault on the remaining German positions came directly from General John J. Pershing himself. The American Expeditionary Force commander had grown impatient with the prolonged battle for what was, strategically speaking, a relatively small patch of French woodland. More importantly, German forces were massing for their anticipated final push toward Paris, and every enemy battalion tied down in Belleau Wood was one less unit available for the assault on the French capital. Captain Lloyd Williams, now commanding what remained of the 51st Company, gathered his surviving Marines in a shell-torn clearing at the southern edge of the wood. The men who faced him bore little resemblance to the fresh-faced recruits who had crossed the Atlantic just months earlier. Their faces were gaunt with exhaustion, their uniforms torn and filthy, but their eyes held the hard gleam of professional killers. The plan was elegantly simple in concept, but nightmarish in execution. 3 companies of Marines would advance simultaneously from different directions, using coordinated artillery fire to suppress German positions, while close support aircraft strafed enemy strongpoints. The assault would be preceded by the heaviest bombardment yet directed against Belleau Wood, with French 75s and American howitzers saturating every known German position. First Lieutenant Graves Erskine had spent the previous night crawling through the German wire, marking enemy positions with phosphorus grenades that would guide the artillery barrage. The young officer from Louisiana had volunteered for the reconnaissance mission, despite having been wounded twice in previous engagements. His detailed intelligence would prove crucial to the assault's success, providing American gunners with precise coordinates for their fire missions. The artillery preparation began at exactly 0500 hours on June 26, 1918. For 30 minutes, American and French guns pounded the remaining German positions with an intensity that shook the earth for miles around. Ancient oaks that had survived centuries of French history toppled like matchsticks under the devastating bombardment. The very air seemed to vibrate with the concussion of exploding shells. According to contemporary reports filed by war correspondents embedded with the attacking forces, the final assault on Belleau Wood represented American military power at its most concentrated and effective. The coordination between artillery, infantry, and aviation that had been lacking in earlier attacks finally came together in a demonstration of modern combined arms warfare. Sergeant Dan Daly led the first wave of Marines out of their assault positions at 0530, his 44-year-old legs carrying him forward with the same determination that had made him a legend in the old corps. Behind him came the survivors of 3 weeks of hellmen who had been tested beyond the limits of human endurance and had refused to break. The German response was immediate but disorganized. Machine gun fire from previously unknown positions raked the advancing Marines, but the preparatory bombardment had severely disrupted enemy communications. German officers found themselves commanding isolated strongpoints with no contact with higher headquarters or adjacent units. Marine aviation played a crucial role in the final assault. Pilots like Ralph Talbot flew their DH-4 aircraft at treetop level, machine gunning German positions and dropping small bombs on suspected ammunition dumps. The psychological effect of air attack on troops accustomed to fighting only ground forces was significant, adding another dimension to an already complex battlefield. By noon on June 26th, Marine patrols had reached the northern edge of Belleau Wood. Scattered German resistance continued throughout the afternoon, but the organized defense had finally crumbled under the weight of American determination. Small groups of enemy soldiers surrendered from positions that had held out for weeks, their faces showing the same exhaustion that marked their American captors. Captain Clifton Cates dispatched the message that would echo through Marine Corps history. Wood's now entirely in hands of U.S. Marines. The area has been swept and mopped up. Casualties have been heavy. Request immediate artillery support to hold gains. The Battle of Belleau Wood was finally over, but its legacy was just beginning to take shape. The silence that settled over Belleau Wood on the evening of June 26, 1918, was more profound than any sound the Marines had heard in 3 weeks of continuous combat. Captain Lloyd Williams stood among the shattered remnants of what had once been a pristine French forest, watching his surviving men emerge from positions they had held at the cost of everything they had to give. The toll had been staggering even by the brutal standards of the Great War. The Marine Corps had suffered over 5,000 casualties in the battle for Belleau Wood, more than the Corps had lost in its entire previous history combined. Entire companies had been reduced to squad strength, and some units existed only in the memories of their few survivors. The 4th Brigade had entered the battle as one of the finest military formations in the American Expeditionary Force. It emerged as a collection of hardened veterans who had been forged in the crucible of modern warfare. General John J. Pershing arrived at Belleau Wood on June 28th to personally congratulate the survivors and assess the strategic significance of their victory. The commander of American forces in France found men who bore little resemblance to the eager volunteers who had sailed from the United States just months earlier. These were professional warriors now, marked by experiences that had aged them beyond their years. The German withdrawal from Belleau would mark the beginning of the end for the spring offensive that had brought enemy forces to within 40 miles of Paris. Crown Prince Ruprecht's army group, deprived of the forward positions they needed to launch their final assault on the French capital, began a strategic withdrawal that would eventually carry them back beyond the German border. The sacrifice of American Marines had helped save Paris from German occupation. French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, Supreme Allied Commander, visited the battlefield in early July to present the survivors with the Croix de Guerre. In recognition of their extraordinary valor, the French government renamed Belleau Wood Bois de la Brigade de Marine, an honor that would endure long after the last veteran had passed away. The Marines had earned their place among the elite fighting forces of the world. Through blood and sacrifice, the legend of the Devil Dogs spread throughout the American Expeditionary Force and eventually back to the United States, where newspapers carried accounts of Marine heroism that captured the imagination of a nation hungry for heroes. The nickname, originally bestowed by German enemies who had learned to respect American fighting spirit, became a badge of honor that Marines would wear with pride for generations to come. Individual acts of heroism during the battle became the stuff of military legend. Sergeant Dan Daly and Gunnery Sergeant Ernest Jansen both received the Medal of Honor for their actions at Belleau Wood, joining a select group of Marines who had earned their nation's highest decoration for valor. Their exploits would be riddled in recruit training for decades, inspiring new generations of Marines to live up to the standards set by their predecessors. The tactical lessons learned in Belleau Wood revolutionized American military doctrine. The importance of combined arms coordination, the value of close air support, and the necessity of thorough reconnaissance became fundamental principles that would guide American forces through future conflicts. The Marine Corps emerged from the battle with a reputation for aggressive tactics and unwavering determination that would serve them well in the Pacific campaigns of World War II, as documented in official Marine Corps histories compiled in the decades following the armistice. Belleau Wood represented more than a tactical victory. It was the crucible that forged the modern Marine Corps' identity. The men who fought in those woods discovered reserves of courage and endurance they never knew they possessed, setting a standard of excellence that would inspire Marines for generations. Captain Clifton Cates, who had refused evacuation despite multiple wounds, would later become Commandant of the Marine Corps, carrying the lessons of Belleau Wood into the highest levels of military leadership. His experiences in the French forest shaped his understanding of what Marines could accomplish when properly led and adequately supplied. The memorial that stands today in Belleau Wood bears a simple inscription in memory of officers and men of the 4th Marine Brigade who gave their lives in the conquest of this wood, June 1918. But those words cannot capture the full significance of what happened in those weeks of desperate fighting. The Marines who died at Belleau Wood had saved Paris, helped turn the tide of the Great War, and established a legacy of courage that would echo through the corridors of history. Their sacrifice had earned them immortality among the greatest warriors America had ever produced. They were, and would forever remain, the Devil Dogs of Belleau Wood.